And I actually have a book coming out with CRC Press sometime probably next year on security with service-oriented architectures. So I'm definitely pimping the book. Moving on. A quick thank you to so many individuals who have been responsible for my success within the profession. I want to do a brief shout out to Dr. Mike Lloyd, without whom this presentation would not exist, as well as the folks at FAIR, the Open Group, everybody at the Society for Information Security Risk Analysts, which is an organization that I highly recommend you consider joining. And of course, the good folks at Walt, without whom I would not be a security professional today. And the information, I always forget what ISSA stands for, to be honest with you. It's a membership-based organization. We meet 6 times a year. We promote security education for security professionals. Very, very worthwhile organization. It's something I've been part of for the past 15 years. Has helped shape my career, and I highly encourage, if you're not a member, to consider looking into it. So let's start out with what is information security risk and how can we measure it. Information security risk is a subset of business risk. It is what could happen to business data, what could happen to business information, and obviously as you manage it, how do you prevent those things from happening? The trouble is that there are many, many different definitions of exactly what information security risk is. And I want to give you a brief overview of that before we get into exactly how you measure it. So let's start out with the classic definition. This is the definition that comes out of NIST. That risk is the probability of an event happening multiplied by the impact of that same event. And the trouble with this philosophy of defining risk is that would allow you to say that the risk of a low impact, high frequency event, spam, is exactly the same risk as a high-impact, low-frequency event, a bomb going off. I severely doubt that anybody in this room would classify spam as having the same risk to your organization as a bomb going off. And certainly you're not going to put the same level of controls behind that. So the problem with this particular definition is it doesn't help you make good, sound business decisions. So we're going to take it and we're going to throw it out along with so much else that comes from this. So what is risk then? Risk is the potential that a given threat will exploit a vulnerability or on a group of assets and cause harm to an organization. That definition comes from ISO 27005. It implies a metric, and that metric is harm. So to understand and measure risk, you have to understand and measure threat, vulnerability, assets, and impact, your metric. So I'm going to start out with how do you assess risk, and there are a variety of different methodologies of going about doing this, all of which have some pros and cons, and I'm not here to pimp any particular risk assessment methodology. I am using one in particular, but just because that's what I'm using doesn't mean that you can't use the analytical techniques I'm going to talk about in part of any of these others. Octave is very customizable. You can use this methodology inside of Octave. You can do the same with ISO 27005. Risk IT is a great analysis tool, especially if you're using COBIT. Stay the hell away from NIST because they're going to force you to use that classic definition of risk, which we just threw out. And I would recommend that you stay away from PARA as well because it only looks at risk of being attacked. And that's not exactly a comprehensive look at information security risk. The Risk Management Cookbook is a very, very nice analytical methodology for doing analysis of risk that came from a partnership of the Open Group and the folks who did the factor analysis of information security risk, FAIR. They have published this. This is freely available. It's a nice synthesis of ISO 27005, which you now don't have to pay for, and the methodology behind the factor analysis of information. And the best thing is that the Open Group modified FAIR to make it usable. That's what I'm going to build off of. It gives you both a process and a means to measure risk. So in order to identify risk, define your scope, identify your assets, identify the threats, identify controls, vulnerabilities, consequences, and bang. Let's go into it in a little bit more detail. So with assets, your CFO is going to have one definition of an asset, your chief executive officer is going to have another definition of an asset, your Your IT manager is going to have another definition of an asset. Your accountant's going to have different definitions, and they are all right. There's no reason to use one set of definitions versus another set of definitions. Capture everything that they all have to say about the assets to your organization. The most important asset likely is your data. After all, you are in the information security profession. Information is likely your most important asset to you, but it's not necessarily the case to others in the organization. Everybody's right here. Aggregate. And when you're starting to put together what value is more than just money. Sometimes the value of something is based upon your reputation, or fines that will be incurred, or the cost of the incident response, or the loss of productivity. When you're sitting down what the value of an asset is, take into account all of these different factors. If you're a public company, what's the impact to investors? If you're a private company, it still may be, what's the impact to investors? After all, private companies have investors too, they're called venture capitalists. Many of these values, if you don't have precise numbers, can be estimated if you don't have precise numbers using a Monte Carlo situation. We'll get more into that later on. This gets you a value towards harm. If you go no further than identifying what the value of these assets are, you've gone a long way. Threat. Many different kinds of threats have the same impact on your organization. So what you want to do here is protect against the impact, not protect against the threat. If you plan around the impact, you're protecting your organization at the same time against a tsunami and a bomb, and an earthquake, and a tornado, and a hurricane. If you prevent against the threat, then you're going to have to worry about, oh my God, how do we protect against a hurricane? Versus, oh my God, how do I protect against a bomb? Protect against the impact, not the threat. Now, when you start to look at what are my threats so that I know how to protect against them, it pays to work with categories that other people have already thought out. So the methodology I'm presenting to you is based upon the Basel on threat categories, which comes out of the financial industry. So there's going to be a slant within that. You'll see categories of internal fraud versus categories of external fraud, which may or may not have relevance to your organization as we dive down into them. But it's a very, very useful set of predetermined categories that you can build off of. It's a starting place. And if you're curious to know what the details of are these threat categories, here they are in living color. And oh, by the way, they're in the spreadsheet. Controls. You have to know and understand what controls you have in place. More importantly, you have to know why you have those controls in place. And yes, you should make some determination of how effective those controls are. So how do you get this knowledge? You ask, you audit, you test. And there'll be other presentations that get into, well, how do you go about auditing some of these things? How do you go about testing some of these things? Testing, penetration testing, auditing. Your auditor is your best friend. Control categories. Again, when you're doing analysis, it helps to divide these things into different categories. I like the ISO 27002 category, as other people like the COVID categories. What I like most about the ISO 27002, I'm lazy. Somebody's already taken ISO 27002 and mapped them against those bits of evidence. So I've got this nice matrix of threat versus control. And we're going to leverage that as we go forward. Vulnerabilities. You'll find so much literature in the security space about vulnerabilities. It's really just a method through which a threat can act on an asset. Or you can think of it in terms of a gap in a control. Now you can only protect what you know, which is why you don't protect assets against vulnerabilities, you protect assets against threats. Impact. Harm. This is what you really care about. Now, not all impacts compromise the entire value of an asset. It's possible to have an impact against control that does not impact confidentiality. If somebody steals the encrypted database, it's no longer in your control. They've got a copy of the encrypted database. They can launch out-of-band attacks against that database, but for the moment at least, because it's encrypted, it is still confidential until they break the encryption. You've just lost control. Different levels of impact have, well, different consequences. The value of the protection, however, should always be less than the value of the asset. So if you're doing AES 256 level encryption against a listing of lunch menus, you've probably gone too far. So your CEO says X, your CFO says Y, we've already gone through this, they're all correct aggregate, moving towards analysis. So where multiple assets are impacted, aggregate the results, establish a scale, and the scale should be proportional to the impact, it should be proportional to frequency, capability, etc. The idea is you're establishing a model. Models reflect reality, models are never reality, models can always be adjusted. And so what I'm presenting to you is the shell of that model that you're getting into. As you get closer to analysis, you measure the impact by talking to people, getting an idea of what the asset values are. Frequency, take a look at your Verizon reports, take a look at your Phonoman reports, take a look at your Microsoft reports, get a sense of how frequency events like this occur, take a look at the capability of the threat, take a look at the strengths and controls you have, look at the degree of vulnerability, and some of these measurements can inform other things. For instance, a loss event frequency is really just a factor of the vulnerability and the threat event frequency. When you start doing aggregation, you want to aggregate different elements as well. And sometimes it pays to take a look at things at the level of threat event frequency. Sometimes it pays to do a deeper dive and take a look at, backwards. Sometimes it pays to take a look at the level of loss event frequency. Sometimes you want to do a deeper dive and look at vulnerabilities and threat event frequencies. It's really a matter of the context in which you need to do your analysis. And sometimes you need to estimate. Estimation is not a bad thing. The trick is that if you understand the relationship between the two categories, estimation can become more informed. This is the chart that's out of that open group cookbook that I mentioned. It lays out the relationship between the different categories. This is free, available, download, use it. So it shows how primary loss factors are derived from a combination of asset and threat. It shows how in their methodology, secondary loss factors come from organizational versus environmental, and how they are tied into a loss magnitude to get at that impact level of harm. It shows how in their methodology, they look at vulnerability as threat versus control. Or in other words, the vulnerability is really the gap in the controls, etc. An estimation can be done at any point on the tree where you don't have hard data. And as you move forward with your methodology, you put in place better data, this thing gets more precise over time. So vulnerability is, again, the capability to get past your controls. It's nothing more than that. The CVSS2 numbers provide a point base of comparison, but only if they are placed in the context of your controls. So the numbers that you get from your Nessus scan, or from your Rapid7 scan, or from your other vendor scan, they're a great starting place. But the CVSS numbers are meant to be placed into the context of your environment. And so what you're supposed to do after you get those numbers from your scan is put them inside of this calculator in the context of your environment to find out that that 10 is really for you a 2 because of where it sits in your network and the other controls in place. That 2 is the number you care about, not the 10 that Nexpose gave you. Probability. I love this. Probability is the most misunderstood part of statistical analysis. Let me give you an example. Everyone in this room has 100% probability of dying. Yes, I'm known as the killjoy at parties. Your chance of dying right now, however, is significantly less than 1%. That's an event frequency. This is why probability is not terribly useful. What you want to care about is what is the chance of dying right now, not the chance of dying, which is 100%. So event frequency is the chance of something happening right now, and that's what you want to take a look at. And by the way, if you didn't understand why the NIST method of measuring risk was broken before, keep in mind that NIST measures risk off of probability, not off of event frequency. This is why looking at risk from the classic point of view of the probability of an event times the impact of event is a broken way of doing analysis. Frequency. Frequency can be derived from historical data, but past performance is no guarantee of future events. See Sony the day before the compromise. So taking a look at historical data to try to get a sense of what's going to happen is not exactly the best way to go about it. This is why the people who do well at the stock market don't look at historical data. They do some event frequency analysis. Now we can do that a little bit based upon how easy it is to contact the vulnerability. What is the probability that somebody would go about exploiting this? How attractive are we as a target? And you can estimate these things using a beta-PERT distribution. And things get better as you calibrate. And I'll talk a little bit about calibration in a moment. But I will expose the mechanics of how beta-PERT works and to talk about it as an analytical model versus other analytical models. And what do I mean by calibrating? So let's start with calibration as a measure of your confidence in the numbers you provide. And sometimes the more knowledgeable you are, you get a false sense of confidence. And let me give you an example. On what day was the Declaration of Independence voted on by Congress? Can anybody tell me who hasn't seen this presentation before and is now Googling? Please. Jim.
July 2nd.
July 2nd. Anybody else in the room? I'm hearing stony silence. July 2nd. Just happens to be 100% correct. Thank you, Jim. It was ratified on July 4th, which is the date that pretty much everybody knows. But the moment I threw the question in the air, everybody who thought they knew July 4th questioned their own knowledge. Well, what you should have done is said, okay, it could not have been later than July 4th. So I should probably pick a date between June 1st and July 4th. And I have now calibrated my answer. That's what calibration is choosing a range of possibilities and saying it is between here and here. And more precision than that may not be more important for what I'm trying to understand. Experts overestimate their level of confidence until they've learned how to calibrate. And by the way, if you haven't run out and purchased How to Measure Anything by Doug Hubbard, no, I don't get proceeds on the book. Go out, buy the book, read the book. It's more important than anything. It teaches you how to calibrate. There are some great calibration exercises in it, and he's got some great papers on doing calibration that are supplements to the book that are freely downloadable on his website. How to Measure Anything, an excellent, excellent book. So now with the beta-PERT. Beta-PERT provides a reliable way to estimate probability. It basically allows you to calibrate a mean differently than your classic average. Takes a look at an optimistic estimate added to G times the most likely estimate, added to the pessimistic estimate, divided by that same G plus 2 to get to the estimate of likelihood. And in the classic PERT distribution, G is a constant, G is 4. Now, a lovely, lovely analyst by the name of David Rose proposed that to replace G with a value indicating confidence, you get a more realistic estimate of frequency. Leading to this formula right down here, which is the formula that I use in my spreadsheet. Now, confidence is obviously a variable around 4. How close to 4 you get, how close to the classic PERT distribution you are. The further away from 4 you are, the less confidence you have in your estimates. And you can use that as you collect your data in order to express your own uncertainty about your estimates, providing a more reliable analysis in the process. Now, there are some people who think that PERT distributions need random number inputs. Namely Microsoft, they give you these great formulas for PERT built into Excel that depend upon random number inputs. Other people disagree with that. One of the reasons why I went with ISO 27005 is the idea that the measurement should be consistent over time, and that does not depend upon random numbers. Other analysts think that no, you need to introduce a randomness into this. Make your own decisions and go. This is what a beta PERT distribution looks like, and the target that you're trying to hit is that number right there. That is your mode, that is the number that you want to hit. An alternative model is to take a look at the power law distribution. Power law distribution, you calculate the slope and the intercept using a random generator, the size of the event and the event frequency. And this has been a great model for showing the frequency and the magnitude of disasters, and is often used to calculate hurricanes and earthquakes and the impact of those magnitudes. So this is a great alternative model, especially if you're doing business impact analysis sorry to me, regarding business continuity risk. So again, you don't have to grow with a PERT distribution model. You can go with the power law distribution model. It will provide you with a different analysis. Go with the one that's more appropriate for your context. Now, I mentioned Excel. Excel is a wonderful tool, and there are some power law distribution formulas built into Excel. There's a PERT formula built into Excel, but it depends upon randomness. So what a bunch of folks did is they created a lovely free add-on to Excel called OpenPERT that gives you better PERT formulas that do not rely upon randomness. Also, there's a wonderful PERT commercial tools available from Lowe's software. I mentioned David Lowe's earlier, and RiskAmp, which provides their own PERT distribution for much less than what David Lowe's does. And of course, there's always Excel itself, which is a commercial tool. Now, calculating risk. So you've got your asset catalog, which you derive from interviews. You have an impact to the organization. You've got your threat catalog, bits or other threat catalogs. You've got your controls catalog, ISO 27000X or COVID or something else. You've done your vulnerability analysis. You've got your CVSS scores. If you're smart, you put them in the environmental context using that freely available calculator on the NIST site. And you're getting the sense this takes time. It does. But you do some frequency estimation, calibration, and finally, you've got your impact. So you're now ready to do some risk calculation. And I'm going to throw a curveball into this before we do so, and that is what's called a Monte Carlo simulation. Monte Carlo simulation is a methodology of estimating reality. It was used within the Manhattan Project, and it works wonderfully if you feed into it the results of your beta PERT distributions. Because it depends upon needing a uniform distribution with a large variety of inputs. It performs a deterministic computation and allows you to aggregate results. It is the perfect tool to estimate impact. And it's freely available. And results look somewhat like this. And again, you care about the numbers up in here. You don't want to worry about the outliers. You want to care about your modes. Those chances where it's most likely to happen. Frequency analysis, not probability. Now, we'll worry about after the analysis. Let's get into the tool. So this is a tool that I built, and the reason why I built it is because, to be honest with you, I'm the security manager of a small enterprise. I don't have $20,000 to spend on somebody else's tool. I don't have $20,000 to spend on a consultant who's going to come in and tell me, oh, in order to measure your risk, what you do is you take the CVSS numbers of all your vulnerabilities from point of egress to your data point, you add them together, and that's your risk metric. I've just wasted $20,000. And by the way, there are consultants who do exactly that. So this is that BITS spreadsheet that I mentioned, which is freely available off the BITS site. What I've done is I've expanded on it. So what I've added to it here is, first of all, I've used the filtering of Excel to allow me to filter on different asset categories. Now let me just expand upon that. And here's my Basel loss categories. Let me expand upon that so you can see everything that's in here. And I'll expand on my threat events. And everything else is already expanded. And now you can see as I go through this that I have, as I page down, just a few items. In fact, there's over 600 line items in the spreadsheet, which is why having the filtering really helps you out, because if all you care about is doing an analysis of, let's say, bomb threats, I can isolate that down and take a look at all the controls I have in place regarding bomb threats. Or something slightly more realistic, let's say that I want to take a look at all the threat events I have regarding DNS failure. I can isolate that one down and just focus in on DNS failure. And I do this on a per asset basis. Let's take a look at some of the other things we have there. Now that's based upon your threat events, but what about the different vulnerability categories? And you can expand on this, but let's say that you only want to care about, expanding this out here a little bit, so you can read these things. You want to care about confidential discussions taking place in unsecured areas because I'm running a hospital. I can isolate out that particular vulnerability and do an analysis based upon that. Or I can do the entire category.
Are you accepting questions?
I am accepting questions. Let's try to keep all the questions for the end.
Okay.
And again, there are different security controls that just happen to map to those vulnerabilities, how I am trying to prevent these things, ideally. Now, what I've done is I've added to that fine work that Bits put in. Okay, great. And I've added in the analysis. So I have a threat capability. I have a control strength. So let me expand out my threat capability. I'll walk through one of these things. So, what is the minimum skill needed in order to perform internal fraud, exploiting the vulnerability regarding timed logons? What's the minimum skill set needed for that? What's the most likely skill set needed for that? What's the maximum skill set needed for that? On a scale of 100. I put out those numbers. I put in my confidence on those numbers that I've just estimated in. And I get an analysis using that PERT distribution formula that I've talked about, which I've hand put in so you can see the analysis being done, that gives me my estimate on the likelihood of this happening in my organization. Once I've captured that, I then separately analyze the strengths of the controls that I've put in place against those, in order to get into what is my actual vulnerability as I compare the strength of my control to how easy it is to exploit the vulnerability. Now, I'm pulling this out of an embedded spreadsheet that does that comparison. So let's take a look at that particular spreadsheet. So that's the vulnerability spreadsheet, the vulnerability worksheet. I'll show you what I'm doing here. So I compare control strength versus vulnerability strength to get into an aggregate number. And I've built both of those, vulnerability strengths and control strengths, based upon a PERT distribution of my confidence level, comparing the minimum and the maximum. Going back here. And so I do this with vulnerability. I do this with threat event frequency, for loss event frequency. And then I start putting in the actual impacts. And I pull the impacts from the probable loss magnitude table. But what I'm doing here is I'm putting in, again, minimum, mode, maximum, my confidence level of the actual dollar amounts of an impact to my organization based upon cost to respond, cost to replace, any fines I may incur, etc. Now, if I'm smart, I take in those basic estimates, which remember are aggregate numbers I get from my CFO, from my CEO, from my accountants, from other experts within the organization. I aggregate those numbers, and then I do a Monte Carlo simulation on them. And you're probably saying, that looks like a lot of work. Let me show you what OpenPERT gets you. It's an add-on. It plugs very, very nicely in. What we're going to do is we're going to do a better PERT simulation. And let's say we're going to put in a minimum estimate of $1 million. Yes, $1 million. And the most likely estimate is $2.5 million.
typed in 100K.
I can't read without my reading glasses on, which means I can't see any of you. So I've got the minimum of 100K. I've got a likelihood, or more likely, of 2.5 million. And let's put in 10, whatever that number is. And here we go. A nice little Monte Carlo simulation that tells me where I need to pay attention to in terms of the impact to my organization, numbers that I can capture out of here, bring back into my analysis in order to get access to risk. So I bring those numbers backwards, all the way back to my key risk measurement tool, and I put those numbers in for each one of these categories: productivity, response, replacement, fines, competitive advantage, to finally get at, for this particular threat event, again, acting on this vulnerability against that control set, in my environment, in the context of these impacts, this is the likely impact of my organization and money. And then, which ones do I care about? I care about the big ones. I start to manage those first. Very, very elegant way of deciding what to care about first. If I just filter on, as an example, everything that is $1 million or more, just turning off all of these things. I can turn off seeing all the vulnerabilities that have a negligible impact on my organization. I don't worry about those right now. I worry about the ones that are going to have an impact of $1 million or more. And if my enterprise is big enough where we can afford a risk loss of over $1 million, I filter higher. But I always start with the greatest impacts, and I use that to prioritize the management of risk. Getting back to finally, okay, I've done the analysis, what do? I communicate. I bring this up to upper management. I let them make a business decision what we're going to do to remediate those risks, so we shore up the controls on vulnerabilities where we have $1 million exposure or more, and all of a sudden I have no trouble getting budget in order to address the concerns. And they had input to these things, and I can show them how their numbers impacted the results of this analysis. And none of this is rocket science. This is all standard business analysis. This is stuff they'll get. Does anybody have any questions? Yes?
Early in your talk, you made a really fascinating statement: protect against the impact, not the threat. And I was wondering if this was that, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
This is exactly that. That's why I asked the questions at the end. Yes?
So a bunch of us last year have been trying to push adversary-centric analysis into this, because it's not simply what's most important to you, it's what's most important to them.
That's an excellent point.
And there's a very high affinity between an adversary class and their motive and certain asset types and their methods.
Mm-hmm.
So you can look at the Verizon report and see very tight clustering. It's less than 10% of the art of the possible for script keys, etc.
Yeah, the trouble with the Verizon report, and you want to keep this in mind when looking at some of these reports, is they have interesting little biases.
I agree. That's not the point. It's
Yeah.
immaterial. There are tight clusters of who wants what and how they go about it, and many of our models like this don't factor that. So you may have $1 million asset that isn't targeted by anybody.
Right.
Are you starting to work adversary priorities into these?
Absolutely. Matter of fact, that is why you take a look at,
I agree with you about bias.
yeah, that's why what you want to do is, when you're taking a look at this stuff, see if I have time to break it down for you. Probability of action.
So you nest it in there?
I nested in that. So if I break that down, that's where I look into what is the likelihood of my adversaries taking action against this? Is this a target that they're after?
Yeah, I think one of the mistakes is people protecting PCI data, but not public websites, and non didn't care about PCI data, they cared about public websites.
Yeah.
So
And so
I find executives respond very well to adversary categories.
they do. And the Terra model, by the way, of risk analysis, is built off of exactly that kind of perspective. And so it's not a bad approach to take. The impact to your organization is going to be necessarily low relative to other threat events. So it's just one kind of analysis that you're going to want to do. For certainly what Anonymous did to Sony with their attacks was very colorful, made the news, but in terms of actual dollar values on the balance sheet, it had a negligible impact compared to what other attacks have, as an example, the attack on Hannaford and what that did to their bottom line. So yes, PCI data may not be what Anonymous is going after, but the impact of the organization if you get compromised is significantly higher. And you want to be managing your risks based upon reputational data or based upon actual harm to the organization? The answer to the question is yes. The big issue there is prioritization. And by capturing that language inside of this part of the analysis, you've got the attacker story captured. And unfortunately, I only have an hour, so I don't have a chance to go into every aspect of it. Anybody else with questions?
Is your slide deck available online?
Slide deck is available. It will be available part of the security BSides stuff. I can make it available to anybody who doesn't want to wait. The spreadsheet is available. This is all built off of other people's work just being brought together into one place. So it's a free tool. You want it, you got it. Anybody else?
Can we get yours?
Yes! You can, as long as you come and work for me. Obviously, the analysis I've done on my company is confidential. You'll have to sign an NDA, you'll have to come work for us. But yes, you can get it.
No, I just want like the formulas pre-built in. So
Yes, no. I will get you the spreadsheet. If you want the spreadsheet, it's yours.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Thank you for coming.